In today's video, I'm going to share my favorite color of gray background and how to choose which gray background is right for you. Hey everybody, Lindsay Adler here, and if you've ever looked at a Savage Universal sample paper guide, you might have noticed that they have more than a dozen different colors of gray backgrounds. And so that begs the question, which color gray should you get? Now, as you're deciding on which background to purchase, there are two main categories of considerations. First of all, there is the tonality, meaning the lightness or darkness. Do you want a lighter gray, almost white? Do you want something in the middle? Do you want it to be a dark, rich gray, almost black? And then the other category of considerations is the warmth or coolness of that background. Do you want it to be really, really neutral? Do you want it to have a little bit of warmth? Do you want it to be a little bit more beige, or do you want it to be a little bit cooler? And so this is why there really are so many different variations of the background, is because the background choices are variations of those two elements. Keeping these considerations in mind, what color gray backgrounds do I use? What do I have in my studio? And to be honest, I have several different colors of gray because, of course, as with anything in photography, there's the right tool for the job. The color gray that I use most often is fashion gray. Fashion gray is a little bit lighter, but it is also a teeny bit cooler, but it is generally neutral. I use this most often for my fashion editorials and when I'm trying to shoot something that is clean on gray. However, when I want to go more dramatic, I'm using the Thunder Gray over here on the right-hand side, and I also have a TV gray. This is a lighter tone gray, but it is a little bit warmer. I use this gray if I'm, say, photographing a subject where I want to have their skin tone appear a little bit warmer, or they're wearing a cream dress, and I want to unify the tones of the background with the subject. Having just that little bit more warmth, I think ends up being more flattering for showcasing those sorts of features. So why would I go for something a tiny bit cooler like fashion gray? Well, I like the little bit more coolness on the background because skin tones are generally warmer, so I find this creates a little bit more pop and contrast. So if you could only get one gray background, what would it be? And it kind of depends on what your needs are, but I know that my choice would be fashion gray. So now let's take a look at fashion gray in action, and I'll show you why this color background is so versatile. Now we have a fashion gray background, and I have an extra large umbrella with diffusion to the left-hand side of the scene. We're going to use the position and feathering of this light in order to change what our background looks like. So let me show you what we're working with. So far, the light mostly feathered towards the subject and that background. You can see that there's a beautiful quality of light on her face, and that fashion gray background appears a little bit lighter. It basically appears as it does to our eye. But I know that there's some flexibility based on the position of our light. So what we're going to do is we are going to feather that light. What that means is I'm going to change the angle, change the relative position. So the actual position of the light in space will stay the same, but I'm going to point it across the frame. And what this means is that less light will reach the background, and therefore it becomes darker. So I'm going to feather the light just a little bit to start off with. Good. You can see that the background got darker, a little bit richer, a little bit more dramatic. So far, so good. But did you know you can feather even more than this? When you feather, you actually don't even need to have the light pointed at your subject hardly at all. It'll still be a soft quality of light. You might lose a little exposure, but I'm going to feather the light so that it is pointed almost completely across the scene, away from my subject. I'll make that background go even darker. So let's try there. Yeah, way across the scene. Perfect. You can see that the result in this image is much darker. The background goes almost black, and it's really rich and dramatic. So this is one of the reasons I like a fashion gray so much. Depending on the amount of light I add or take away from the background, I can make it appear lighter or darker. Now, if I want this background to go completely black, I can block the light even more. For example, I could take a V-flat and place it in between the light and the background. The subject will still get the illumination, but the light won't reach the background and it will just be completely black, which is really nice because then I don't need to switch backgrounds. If I decide I want something darker, I simply reduce the amount of light hitting that background. When I know that the entire shot is going to be darker and more dramatic, I usually will grab something like a Thunder Gray. I never, or hardly ever, grab black unless I know I want it to be pure black, Because if I want to add, let's say, a highlight on the background, maybe a little bit of a glow behind my subject. If I have a black background and I add a light, it takes a lot of power to be able to see any light on that background. But a thunder gray is just light enough and just reflective enough that I can create a halo of light, a glow of light, a strip of light, just a little bit of separation. But you'll see here in the fashion gray, depending on how I position my light, I can make it appear as dark as a thunder gray. And one of the things you might notice is that because we've introduced so much shadow to the scene, the subject maybe is blending in a tiny bit with the background. And so I could, as I just mentioned, add another light to the background, or I could feather less so the background appears brighter, or I can add a V-flat. What the V-flat is going to do is that light, it's pointed straight across the scene, which is perfect because you add a white reflective surface, it's going to bounce in and fill in the shadows. So let's add a V-flat world V-flat to the right-hand side of the frame. You can see now that we've lifted up the shadows. Now, I am going to take some time to actually photograph our beautiful subject, try some different poses. I'll try different angles of that feather. Maybe I'll back the V-flat up a little bit if I want a tiny bit of fill, but not completely filled in. Like, there's some variation that I want to get. But before we move on to that, I did want to show you the last characteristic that I change often, which is achieved with color grading. Now, I mentioned before that when you're choosing your gray background, first you're considering tonality, right? Do you want it to be lighter or darker? And then you're considering the color. Do you want it to actually be a little warmer or cooler? What I like about the fashion gray is that it's really easy for me to change and adjust this. So I'm going to show you real quick how I would do that in Capture One. Now, even though I'm doing this in Capture One, you of course could also do this in Lightroom. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pop over and go to the color balance color wheel. Now, I'm thinking that perhaps I want this gray background to go a little bit cooler. I know that I can do it here in color grading. So I'm going to go over to the shadows and I'm going to drag that little dot a little bit more towards blue. And notice how it is cooling down the shadow area. Now, very commonly, what I'll do is cool down the shadows, and then maybe if the skin tones are already warm, it'll create a nice warm, cold contrast. And if I want to warm them up even more, I'll go over into the highlight area, drag that more towards yellow, and what it's doing is it's giving me a complementary contrast. So the subject is going to really pop out from the background. That's a basic color grade, but you'll notice that if I reset, before, the background appeared very neutral, and then after my color grade, I've made it be cooler. And of course, I could do that in the other direction. I could warm up the background. So that's why I like this fashion gray, because yes, it appears relatively neutral, maybe a little bit cool, and then I can push it even further in the direction of a cool toned background. Okay, so now that I have all of the ingredients together, I am going to put together the shot with the pose and the expression. And by the way, I am shooting with a Canon R5 and the 24-105 lens, so I can get full length shots or I can pop in for a nice head and shoulder image. Okay, so can you do me a favor? Can you turn a little bit to your left? Now, hopefully you have a little bit more clarity in deciding which gray background is right for you. And again, here we are using the Savage Universal Fashion Gray. Now, if you want to see the gear used in the making of these images, be sure to check out the links in the description below. And if you want to check out all of the different background options available at Savage Universal, visit savageuniversal.com. Thanks guys, and I'll see you next time.